What happened at the U23 3-on-3 World Cup? What should you look for at the 3-on-3 AmeriCup next month? And what in the world is Isabel Rodrigues working on next? She joins us today to discuss it all.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. You are Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Natalie Heavren, and I'm a features writer and the A10 beat reporter for The Next. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On today's show, we're going to talk about the U23 3-on-3 World Cup, the 3-on-3 AmeriCup, and what stories coming down the pipeline for Isabel Rodrigues. Hello and happy Friday. Joining me today is contributing writer for The Next, Isabel Rodrigues, and of course, she also covers women's sports through the Daily Princetonian. Starting off, I know you talked a lot about her in the Slack, but what did you see from Lexie Hull at the U23 3-on-3 World Cup?
Hey Natalie, hey everybody. Good to be back on the pod, and always good to talk about 3x3, which is slowly becoming maybe my favorite thing in the basketball world as it is. So the U.S. Took a new squad, or fairly new squad of folks to the U23 World Cup that happened this past week. And by this past week, I mean the week before this current week. And Lexie Hull was one of those people. This was her first time playing with Team USA on either the 3x3 or 5x team. And this was her first major international competition as well, and she totally killed it. I mean, she was the top scorer out of both men's and women's, because they play at the same time, by over 5 points, which in 3x3 is a lot. Usually you're talking about margins of like 2 or 3 between top scorers. I mean, Lexie was far and away the most prolific scorer at this event, which is the premier event for under 23 players in the world. So she really knocked it out of the park, to say the least. I mean, the U.S., I think, had a couple of pretty easy matches early on, but they were in a really tough qualifying group with Japan and also with Mongolia in there as well. So it wasn't like they had a super easy road either. And then also they had a couple of injuries pop up throughout the World Cup that were minor. Thankfully, no one was super hurt by the end of it. But I mean, it was not an easy road. And then they obviously played France in the final. France, who ended up winning the World Cup. And so again, I mean, it was just not an easy road. But Lexie was really spectacular. I mean, she showed an aptitude for 3x3 that just is not common, I think, right out the gate for most players. It is a different style of play. It is much faster. You have to react a lot quicker. You have to really be on your feet and have your head in at all times. I think also there's no coach, which I think people aren't really expecting, but because there's no kind of outside person, you're really responsible for your team and how you play at all times. So I think she really adapted to that well. And I'm excited to see where she goes from here. Yeah.
And this was her first 3x3 event?
It wasn't her first, like, ever. I'm sure she's played in the U.S. before and might have even done some stuff before heading to the WNBA, but this was her first international competition and her first with Team USA.
And then do you think she can translate what she accomplished in the tournament into her play in the WNBA next year?
God, I hope so. I think for the Indiana Fever's sake, I think it was really good experience for her to have, especially if she's really looking to take more of that wing position and to really open up her game a little bit more. One thing that I was really encouraged by was that she was not only taking those outside shots that she's pretty well known for, but she was also really taking advantage of open lanes to the basket, showing some really strong drives that I don't think we see from her that often. So really taking advantage of the fact that she does pull those defenses a little bit further out to the perimeter, just because you kind of have to guard her from deep. And so seeing her actually take advantage of that, and then be able to pull people off the dribble as well, was really awesome. And I think that's an evolution to her game that I'm excited to see once the Indiana Fever bring her back for next year. So that's one part of it that I'm really hopeful of. I think also just like the style of 3x3 being much quicker will help her just generally with decision making, and especially in transition, which with this Fever team, I think the fact that they're so young, the fact that they can really push the pace, I think that will be helpful experience as well.
And then, were there any other trends that you saw that stood out to you from the tournament as a whole?
Yeah. So I think one interesting thing about 3x3 as it is that some countries are really starting to treat it like a specialization, whereas others are kind of pulling from their 5x national teams, or not really having that pipeline set up for 3x3. I think the United States is on its way to that. I think the Red Bull 3x events have been really successful and are really starting to encourage professional players who may not have made the WNBA or don't want to go play overseas, giving them an opportunity to do that at home. But it's definitely not as well built up as it is in other countries. I think France is a really good example of that, actually. They've kept relatively the same players together on the 3x circuit. And you can kind of see that that their team was a lot better gelled just because they had more time together. I mean, two of them played on the same U23 Nations Cup team, and that happened a couple of weeks or the month before the World Cup. So they were coming off of that, having that team experience. And I think that translated really well to the World Cup. And there were a couple of other countries as well. Japan is another good example that the US got to play, where they just it's the little things where you can just kind of tell that a group has been playing together for a little bit longer. There's fewer miscommunications. There's just the play looks a little bit smoother. They know exactly which decisions to make when, and it's not something that you're really trying to make up for in the moment. So I will be curious to see if the US starts to specialize a little bit more. Perhaps you don't have in the off season folks who are going to play in the 5x World Cup or for the 5x for the Olympics or other events throughout the year. Maybe those are separate entirely from the people who are playing in 3x. Or maybe we start to see some of those folks from the Red Bull competitions really make more of a splash and be the primary people they pull from instead of just WNBA players. Because, I mean, obviously, the U.S. is still going to have a great chance. They're still some of the best players in the world. Doesn't really matter what style of basketball it is. But as other countries start to specialize more, it's something that's definitely on my radar, is whether the U.S. responds in kind.
And then, were there any other players that impressed you? Any other ones that caught your eye? What else did you see?
Yeah, so there were a ton of different players that really impressed me from a bunch of different teams. So just from France, I think Anna Njak she was probably the player who impressed me the most. I think she had 14 points in that final round and was really just explosive from the 2-point line, which is technically the 3-point line distance-wise, but it counts for 2 points. I mean, she was just phenomenal in that final round. I think one thing that really set her apart, besides her 2-point shot, which was really the most consistent of anybody in that game, was just her ability to use her speed to her advantage. She pulled Emily Engsler off the dribble 3 or 4 times in a row at one point, which was honestly kind of embarrassing to watch. But she just was really excellent. So I'm looking forward to seeing her. And she was one of those who was at the Nations League for France and have won that. So it was good to see her come up with another win here. And then also Yeah, on France, I think their post player, I think she was number 13. I can't remember her last name, but her length is like really impressive. It's like similar to what you see from like Beck Allen in terms of just like her arms are so long. And she was really able to use that to her advantage. I mean, she had multiple blocks in that game and just was really able to use the inside in a way that I don't think a lot of players are able to in 3x because it goes so quickly. You're kind of looking to get kind of the shots that you can get, but a lot of the times, I mean, she was rolling to the basket, finding herself in the post. So yeah, she was really impressive as well. And then lastly, I think from Japan, I think Imori, she was probably the most impressive to me. She was a really excellent shooting guard. I think in the way that you can define it in 3x. And I think her perimeter shooting was really impressive, and her ability to find teammates off of that shot was also pretty awesome.
And coming up next, we'll talk about the upcoming 3x3 AmeriCup tournament and what Isabel loves about 3x3 basketball. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs, and yes, even your women's basketball betting needs. I'm personally not someone that bets on sports, but I love that BetOnline.net offers these options for women's basketball, and it's just generally a very big deal that they offer it. And throughout the WNBA season and the WNBA playoffs, BetOnline made it easy to place a bet with just a couple of clicks. And now that it's almost time for college basketball once again, you'll be able to bet on that as well. From women's basketball to the MLB, NFL, NBA, and NHL, BetOnline.net has got you covered for odds, lines, and games. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. So what is there to look forward to watching at the AmeriCup 3x3 tournament taking place next month? Go ahead.
Yeah. So the AmeriCup is probably the premier 3x3 event in North America. And it's going to happen in early November. I think the date is November 4th, if I remember correctly. And so the U.S. will have a team there. It's one of their major qualifying events in terms of where they can rack up qualifying points for these other 3x3 events. And the U.S. Is going to join 12 or 11 other teams in the AmeriCup. We don't have rosters yet for the event, but I imagine that we'll see some familiar faces. I hope that we get to see Lexie Hull again, and I think also some other folks who played in the women's series for Team USA, which is like the pro level, not under 23, but anybody can kind of get into that. So I would not be surprised if we see some people that we got to see earlier this year. The reason I'm excited for the AmeriCup is that we'll also see Team Canada again. Canada prevailed in the women's series. They've looked excellent all year. So I'm really excited to see who they bring to the AmeriCup and to see that US versus Canada matchup, which is always super fun. Puerto Rico is another one that I'm kind of excited for. They, obviously made a splash at the FIBA 5X World Cup, but they've generally just been on the road up ever since, and this year in particular. So I'm excited to see who they bring as well. And generally, I think it's just a really exciting event. 3X is really fun to watch because it goes really fast. You never know what's going to happen. A team could start off really strong and then kind of lose gas in the middle of the match, and then the whole environment kind of changes. But because the games are only like 20 minutes long, a lot can happen in a really short amount of time. So I'm really looking forward to it. And that date will be November 12th. Or no, just kidding. It's, yeah. So November 3rd. Sorry, that's the date. I'm getting my days mixed up. But November 3rd is when that will begin.
A great lead-in to the start of college basketball on November 7th.
Indeed.
And then, are you excited to watch basketball in a more convenient time zone for you? I know you've been watching basketball at all hours East Coast time between the World Cup and then U23 3x3 World Cup. So are you just excited to watch basketball in a convenient Eastern time zone format?
Yeah, that's definitely a draw for me, that's for sure. So the AmeriCup will be in Miami, so it'll be on Eastern time, and I can watch it throughout the day as opposed to at 7 o'clock in the morning. Which I'm never opposed to. I'm an early riser, so it's always nice to get to start my day with basketball. But I'm happy not to have to wake up a little bit earlier than I would otherwise for it. Um, yeah, and this is going to be the second time that the event is hosted in Miami, so it's exciting to see that that Miami is starting to pop up as kind of a hotbed for 3x3 as well. So this is great, I think, all around.
And then you talked about it a little bit, but what else do you love about 3x3 basketball and what makes it fun for you to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the coolest thing to me about 3x3 is how independent it is. I mentioned that there are no coaches outside of the team members themselves. I mean, there's a coach, but they're not allowed during the game to be coaching folks. So I think the decisions that people make are really interesting, and it comes up with some really like unique types of styles of play, and players can really experiment with things that they might not try during a 5X game. And I think that's been really awesome. The other thing that I really like about it is, I mean, it comes down to how quickly it goes. It really forces people to make decisions really fast. And again, that usually comes up with some pretty unique decisions, for better or for worse. I think it's also just a really fun experimental ground for point guards in particular. Veronica Burton was down with Team USA for the World Cup, and I think like just seeing her progression over the like 5 or 6 games that Team USA was able to play, and her decision making. I mean, I think this was also her first major international event with the US. So for 3x3 at least. So it was exciting to see her take advantage of that. And I am hopeful that it will improve kind of her pace of decision making for the Wings when she returns next season. And I think just generally it's a great way to get some reps in and to really just push the style of play, especially because I think 5X is starting to you hear a lot about like pace and space and really taking advantage of transition. I mean, 3X is the best way to practice that. You don't take the ball out of bounds. There's no pauses in between things. You just go straight from one play to the next. I'm going to publish a newsletter right after this, all about the U23 World Cup, which includes a lot of video clips from the event, just highlights that I found really interesting. And that will frequently include plays where I'm talking specifically about the play right in the middle in between 2 other plays that happened. And happened like back to back for both of the teams that are playing. So things are just going really rapidly. But I enjoy that about it. I think it makes it a lot more exciting.
So that answers my next question of what's the most exciting part of watching it for you. But with the speed of it, is it more difficult to keep up with, or is it more convenient because it's in a 20-minute package versus something you have to sit down for 2 hours for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a draw for it, is the fact that you can just kind of pick it up for 20 minutes and then be done with it. I think sometimes 5X games, because they can go so long, and especially with free throws and fouls and everything, it can really drag on for a long time. I mean, there's fouls and free throws in 3X, but again, because they lead right into the next play, it really doesn't slow the game down very much at all. And so you can really just watch the whole thing through. It does kind of get a little overwhelming sometimes to watch in the moment, especially if you're not used to it, if you're not used to that pace of play. But it's pretty easy to get used to. I think also it's nice for me as a writer because I can pretty easily go back and rewatch plays I found that were interesting, or find plays even. It's much easier to do that than scrubbing through a whole hour and a half long game to find highlights. So if I'm trying to remember, like, oh, I saw Lexie Hull do like a really fun like reverse layup. I don't have to scrub through the entire first quarter just to find it, because 3x games are about the length of a quarter. I think that's a pretty good comp for it. So yeah, I think it's beneficial on both ends, but I do see how it can be a little bit overwhelming for folks who maybe have never watched 3x before.
And coming up next, we'll talk about what stories Isabel is working on now. So anyone who has seen us on Twitter or talked to us in the Slack, if they're our coworkers, knows that we're into pre-WNBA leagues. Are you working on anything related to that?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a story all about the history of women's basketball in California, San Francisco and LA specifically, because it's a part of the WBL project that we've been working on and that y'all have heard a lot about on Locked On in the past couple of weeks. So the WBL being the Women's Professional Basketball League, which ran through the 70s and early 80s. Yeah, I think that's my main focus in terms of pre-WNBA leagues right now. I'm really excited with where that story is going, and there's a lot of really interesting and kind of dramatic stories that come out of it. I think it would make a great follow-up. Personally, I think it would make a great follow-up to Showtime, the Showtime era Lakers documentaries and HBO miniseries that have come out. I think there's a lot of really fascinating and interesting material out of both the California Dreams and the San Francisco Pioneers, who are both part of the WBL. Natalie and I have talked a lot about salaries and players getting paid or not. That factors into a lot of this, so it'll be a really exciting story, I think. And then also just like getting to talk to folks who experienced it firsthand has been pretty cool.
And without giving too much away, I know this is going to be hard for you, but do you have a favorite fact or story or tidbit that you found in your research so far?
Yeah, so a lot of my research has been about the way that the two teams were covered, specifically. So it's involved a lot of reading old newspapers and really digging through the archives of both the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and lots of other fun newspapers with fun names and all that fun stuff. So one thing that I think has always grabbed my attention is just the kinds of language that we see used to describe these teams, or the ways that individual newspapers will cover them, who is just pulling from the AP versus who's going out of their way to really do a deep dive on a game or to really go talk to players. I think that has been one of the most interesting parts to me, is like which papers are putting what resources towards covering the WBL. And I think that has some really interesting implications when you look at it from who's doing that with the WNBA now, who's doing that with women's college basketball right now. Because a lot of things haven't changed, surprisingly. So that I think is one aspect that I'm interested in talking about.
And what do you love about covering these pre-WNBA leagues?
Oh, man. I think for me, just as someone who's interested in the history of the sport, I think just generally they're really good examples, and we can learn a lot from them about how the WNBA operates now and why it operates in some ways and why it doesn't do things that maybe we might want it to do. They're a great way to learn about where that history comes from. I think also, like, in the context of Title IX, I mean, we've talked a lot about the 50th anniversary this year, but I think it's really important to talk about the legacy of Title IX just generally. And so going back to these leagues is a really good way to do that, to really examine the impact that it had on the first group of people that really experienced the benefits of it. So that's another aspect of it that I think is really fascinating. And then also just like some of these leagues were offering, like, I think back to the ABL, specifically the American Basketball League, which predated the WNBA by about a year. But just like using those leagues as an example of what was even possible for women in professional women's basketball, like what in terms of like salary and benefits and the way that the leagues were marketed between the ABL and the WNBA has always been really interesting to me, and I'm excited to look into that more in the coming months. So there's a lot to be learned, and I think we're doing a lot of really interesting work over at the Next that you all should check out. So.
And what else are you working on?
Yeah, I just I'm working on a story preempting the Princeton women's basketball season, so that will be up fairly soon over at the Daily Princetonian, which is where I also do some writing. And I am currently working on a story about prioritization, as well as writing our daily news, or not daily, our twice weekly newsletter, which is called the Morning Post Up. Which is a play on words that I hope people are getting because I worked hard on it. But so those two things are coming up and going on. And then obviously the California story is really important to me that I'm hoping to get out by the end of the year, especially since we're supposed to, hopefully, fingers crossed, get news about the WNBA expansion franchises by the end of the year. So fingers crossed on that. And hopefully, I mean, for my story's sake, it would be great to see it go to California, but obviously I can't speak to where it's actually going to go. So yeah, those are the kind of the three main things that I've got my eyes on, and then obviously following EuroLeague and EuroCup, as well as women's basketball leagues all around the globe. I feel like I'm kind of as the way that some people talk about women's college basketball. I'm less of a college basketball person and more of an international leagues person. So that's where I've got my eyes right now is EuroLeague, and the other league's about to start up. So.
And where can the people find you on Twitter and read everything you write?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Isabel Veroso 78 is my handle, and I'm there pretty much all the time, to be honest. Because whether I can get a story out or whether I can get you some news through Twitter, that's something that I'll try to do. We broke some news about Courtney Vandersloot, and who will not be returning to Sopron in Hungary for the overseas season. She'll be staying stateside for the time being. So that story is ongoing and very interesting. So we got to break some news about that. And yeah, you can find me also over at the Next. I write, again, our twice weekly newsletter, and as well as a number of other things. And then the Daily Princetonian is where I write about all things women's sports. I just had a piece about women's volleyball go live, and we'll have something about women's rugby coming up pretty soon. So lots of things going on now that I think about it.
And I can't wait to read them all. To those listening or watching, come back on Monday to join Missy Heidrich and Gabrielle Lewis for an SEC breakdown, and join me on Tuesday as I break down A10 Media Day. Thank you again for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And now for your second listen, go check out the Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview 2022, a 6-episode extravaganza to get you ready for the NBA season. The local team experts and the NBA insiders of the Locked On Podcast Network and Odyssey all combining into one Ultimate NBA Preview. Search for Ultimate Pro NBA Preview 2022 on your Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.